The haze of marijuana smoke and stale beer hung heavy in the air of the Greenwich Village apartment, a thick fog that obscured the faces of the men standing by the door. For Jimi Hendrix, the greatest guitarist who ever lived, the night of September 11th, 1969, had started like 1,000 others. He was drifting through the neon-soaked underworld of New York City, a god among mortals, looking for a jam session, looking for a party, looking to escape the crushing weight of his own fame. He had walked into the club called The Scene earlier that evening, his Fender Stratocaster slung over his shoulder like a rifle, and the room had parted for him. But now, hours later, the adoration was gone. The music had stopped. And Jimmy, still floating in a chemical fog, realized with a slow, creeping dread that the two men standing in front of him were not fans. They were not asking for an autograph. They were holding snub-nosed 38 revolvers, and they were pointing them directly at his chest. The room was silent except for the hum of a street lamp buzzing outside the window. Jimmy tried to stand up, his velvet pants catching on the edge of the chair, but a heavy hand shoved him back down. "Sit tight, superstar," one of the men grunted. He was a low-level hustler, a street kid with cheap shoes and desperate eyes, the kind of predator who swam in the shallow end of the criminal pool. He did not look like a professional killer. He looked like a man who had seen an opportunity to make a quick buck and had not stopped to think about the consequences. He looked at Jimmy not as a human being, but as a winning lottery ticket that he had just found on the sidewalk. "We're going to make a phone call," the man said, spinning the cylinder of his gun. "And until we get what we want, you belong to us." Jimmy did not fight. He did not scream. He sat there, his mind racing through the haze, trying to understand how the night had turned so wrong so fast. Just hours ago, he had been on stage at Woodstock, controlling a sea of 500,000 people with a single note. Now, he was tied to a chair in a dingy apartment, at the mercy of two amateurs who smelled of sweat and fear. But what neither Jimmy nor his kidnappers realized in that moment was that a clock had started ticking. By taking Jimi Hendrix, these small-time crooks had not just committed a felony. They had signed their own death warrants. They thought they had kidnapped a rock star. They did not know that they had stolen property that belonged to the Gambino crime family. And the Gambinos did not appreciate people touching their investments. To understand the sheer insanity of what was about to happen, you have to understand the landscape of New York City in 1969. It was not the sanitized, tourist-friendly metropolis it is today. It was a rotting apple. The city was bankrupt, the streets were dirty, and the police were overwhelmed. But beneath the chaos, there was order. A brutal, hierarchical order imposed by the 5 families of the mafia. They controlled the garbage collection, the construction sites, the docks, and most importantly, the nightlife. Every club where Jimmy played, every bar where he drank, and every stage where he performed operated under the watchful eye of the syndicate. The music business and the mob business were inextricably linked. You could not sell records, book tours, or run a venue in Manhattan without kicking up a percentage to the wise guys. Jimi Hendrix was the golden goose of this ecosystem. He was generating millions of dollars. His manager, Jeffery, was a man with a shadowy past, rumored to have ties to British intelligence and deep connections to the American underworld. Jeffery was not a man you crossed. He operated in the grey areas where contracts were enforced with baseball bats rather than lawsuits. To the mob associates who worked with Jeffery, Jimmy was not just a musician. He was an ATM machine with an afro. He was a stream of revenue that flowed into the clubs, the radio stations, and the record labels that the families had their hooks in. So, when word hit the street that Jimmy had vanished, it was not treated as a missing persons case. It was treated as a theft of corporate assets. The kidnappers, blinded by greed, had failed to do their homework. They were independent contractors, young toughs who thought they could snatch the most famous man on the planet, demand a ransom, and disappear into the night. They saw Jimmy wandering alone. He was famous for ditching his security and drifting through the city solo, and they made their move. They lured him out of the scene with the promise of high-quality drugs, shoved him into a car, and drove him to a safe house in the countryside of upstate New York, or perhaps a hidden apartment in the city. The details remain shrouded in the fog of history. But the location did not matter. What mattered was the phone call they made next. They called Jimmy's management. They demanded money. A lot of it. They threatened that if they did not get the cash, the guitar god would never play again. It was a classic ransom demand, the kind you see in movies. They expected panic. They expected a quick payoff. What they got instead was a silence on the other end of the line that was colder than the grave. The voice that answered did not sound scared. It sounded angry. It sounded like a man who had just discovered a rat in his kitchen. The kidnappers hung up, congratulating themselves, thinking they had the upper hand. They cracked open beers, looked at their prize tied to the chair, and started counting the money in their heads. They had no idea that back in Manhattan, phones were already ringing in social clubs in Little Italy and Brooklyn. The word went out fast. Who has the kid? It was not a question asked by detectives. It was asked by capos. Men with names like Joe the Cat and Fat Andy started making inquiries. The streets of New York began to vibrate with a specific kind of tension. In the underworld, there are rules. You can hijack a truck of cigarettes. You can rob a bank. But you do not touch a high-profile earner who is connected to the administration without permission. It brings heat. It brings police. It disrupts business. And kidnapping Jimi Hendrix was bringing more heat than a forest fire. In the safe house, the mood began to shift. Jimmy, despite his drug-induced lethargy, sensed it. The kidnappers were getting nervous. They had expected a quick exchange, but hours were dragging into days. They had not received the money yet. Instead, they were getting strange hang-up calls. They saw cars driving slowly past the building. The bravado of the street hustlers was evaporating, replaced by the paranoia of men who realize they have grabbed a tiger by the tail. One of them paced the room, peering through the blinds. "Why have not they paid?" he muttered. "He is Jimi freaking Hendrix. He is worth millions." The other kidnapper looked at Jimmy, who was quietly strumming an acoustic guitar they had let him hold to keep him quiet. "Maybe they do not care," the man whispered. But he was wrong. They cared too much. In a back room of a club in Manhattan, a decision had been made. There would be no ransom paid. Paying a ransom sets a bad precedent. It tells every two-bit punk that they can snatch a star and get paid. No. The decision was to send a message. The order was given to John Roberts, a mob associate who would later become famous as one of the biggest cocaine traffickers in history, but at this time, he was a man who handled problems for the Gambino family. The order was simple: go get the kid. And make sure the guys who took him never do it again. Back in the room, Jimmy looked up from his guitar. His eyes, usually filled with the fire of performance, were tired. He looked at his captors with a strange mix of pity and fear. "You guys really should not have done this," he said softly. "My manager, he knows people." The kidnapper laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "Your manager is a suit, man. We have guns." Jimmy shook his head slowly. He knew something these kids did not. He knew that in the music business, the suits were often more dangerous than the guns. He knew that the people who profited from his music were the same people who ran the unions and the docks. He closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the wall. He was waiting. Not for the police. Not for a hero. He was waiting for the wolves to come and eat the jackals. Outside, the sun was setting over the New York skyline, painting the city in shades of blood and gold. A black Lincoln Continental turned the corner onto the street where the safe house was located. It moved slowly, prowling. The headlights cut through the gloom. Inside the car were 4 men. They were not wearing masks. They did not need to. They were professionals. They checked their weapons, lit cigarettes, and stepped out into the cool evening air. They did not run toward the house. They walked. They walked with the terrifying confidence of men who have the keys to the city. Upstairs, the kidnappers heard the heavy thud of the car doors closing. They froze. They looked at each other. Then they looked at the door. And for the first time, they understood the magnitude of their mistake. They had not kidnapped a rock star. They had kidnapped a made man's paycheck. And payday had arrived. The sound of the door coming off its hinges was not a bang. It was a thunderclap that signaled the end of the amateur hour. Wood splintered and flew across the room like shrapnel, bouncing off the dirty linoleum floor. The two kidnappers, who just seconds ago had been arguing about ransom money and drinking warm beer, scrambled for their weapons. But speed is a relative concept. To a junkie shaking from withdrawal, reaction time is slow. To a professional enforcer who has done this 100 times, reaction time is instantaneous. Before the street hustler could even raise his snub-nosed 38, the first man through the door, a towering figure in a long coat, was already on top of him. There was no conversation. There was no drop the gun. There was just the sickening crunch of a heavy leather boot connecting with a wrist, followed by the metallic clatter of the revolver sliding uselessly across the floor. The dynamic in the room shifted so violently that the air seemed to leave the lungs of everyone present. Jimi Hendrix, still tied to the wooden chair, watched the scene unfold through a haze of confusion and adrenaline. He blinked, trying to focus. The men who had burst in did not look like police officers. They did not shout commands. They moved with a terrifying, silent efficiency. They were wolves breaking into a henhouse, and the foxes who had been terrorizing the hens were suddenly realizing they were not the apex predators they thought they were. The second kidnapper, the one standing near the window, froze. He looked at the intruders, then he looked at the fire escape, calculating his odds. But he saw the look in the eyes of the lead enforcer, a look of absolute, cold detachment, and he knew that if he ran, he would be dead before he hit the sill. He dropped his hands. He dropped his head. The surrender was total. John Roberts, the man leading the rescue, stepped over the groaning kidnapper on the floor and walked straight to Jimmy. He did not look at the criminals. His men were already zip-tying them and dragging them into the kitchen. Roberts looked at the rock star. He saw the terror in Jimmy's eyes, the sweat beading on his forehead, the way his velvet pants were stained with ash. Roberts reached into his pocket. Jimmy flinched, expecting a weapon. Instead, Roberts pulled out a pocket knife and calmly cut the ropes binding Jimmy's wrists. "Mr. Hendrix," Roberts said, his voice low and gravelly, sounding like stones grinding together. "My name is John. Your management sent us. It's time to go." Jimmy rubbed his wrists, the circulation returning with a painful prickle. He stood up, unsteady on his legs. He looked toward the kitchen, where muffled sounds of a struggle, dull thuds and stifled cries, were emanating. "What about them?" Jimmy asked, his voice barely a whisper. Roberts placed a hand on Jimmy's shoulder and guided him toward the door. "Do not worry about them, Jimmy. They are going to receive an education on why you do not touch things that do not belong to you. Walk with me." As they walked down the hallway of the tenement building, Jimmy could still hear the sounds from the apartment. He did not look back. He grabbed his guitar case, the only possession that mattered, and followed his rescuers into the cool night air. The black Lincoln was waiting, engine idling, a hearse for the living. The ride back to Manhattan was surreal. Jimmy sat in the back seat, sandwiched between two silent men who smelled of tobacco and gun oil. They offered him a cigarette. They offered him water. But they did not ask for an autograph. To them, he was not a god. He was a package. He was a bundle of cash that had been retrieved from a burning building. Jimmy stared out the window as the city lights blurred past, realizing that his life had ceased to be his own. He had been stolen by one group of criminals and stolen back by another. The illusion of freedom, the idea of the wild, free-spirited hippie, lay shattered on the floor of that safe house. He was property. Valuable property, cherished property, but property nonetheless. This incident, often glossed over in biographies as a strange weekend adventure, reveals the dark, rotting heart of the music industry in the late 1960s. To understand why the mob was so quick to retrieve Jimmy, we have to look at the man who made the call, Mike Jeffery. If the music business was a shark tank, Mike Jeffery was the Leviathan. A former British intelligence officer with alleged ties to MI6, Jeffery was a man who operated in the shadows. He managed Jimi Hendrix not with love, but with fear. He was rumored to have embezzled millions of dollars from the star, funneling the cash into offshore accounts in the Bahamas. Jeffery had deep, tangled connections with the Genovese and Gambino crime families. He used their clubs to break acts. He used their loan sharks to fund tours. There is a dark, persistent theory among rock historians and insiders that the kidnapping was not just a random act by street thugs. Some believe it was orchestrated by Jeffery himself. The theory goes like this: Jimmy was becoming difficult. He was talking about firing Jeffery. He was asking questions about where the money was going. He was becoming independent. So, Jeffery hired some low-level goons to snatch him, only to have his mob friends swoop in and save the day. It was a classic protection racket psychological operation. Create the danger, then provide the savior. By rescuing Jimmy, Jeffery indebted the star to him forever. See, the message said, the world is dangerous. You need me. You need my protection. You need my friends. Whether this theory is true or whether Jeffery simply utilized his connections to solve a real crisis, the result was the same. Jimi Hendrix returned to the studio terrified, isolated, and completely dependent on the very machine that was bleeding him dry. When the car finally pulled up to the club in Greenwich Village where Jimmy's entourage was waiting, the scene was one of staged relief. Mike Jeffery was there, looking frantic, playing the role of the concerned father figure. He hugged Jimmy. He thanked the private investigators who had brought him home. But Jimmy saw the look in the eyes of the mob enforcers as they shook Jeffrey's hand. It was not the handshake of a client and a service provider. It was the handshake of partners. It was a transaction. Jimmy walked into the club, his guitar in hand, and the music started again. But the notes sounded different now. The darkness that had touched him in that safe house had seeped into his soul. The fate of the kidnappers remains one of the grim mysteries of the New York underworld. They were never arrested. There was no trial. No police report was ever filed. They simply vanished. One day they were two aspiring tough guys looking for a payday. The next day they were ghosts. Rumors circulated in the village for years. Some said they were given a beating that left them crippled and put on a bus to nowhere. Others, more cynical about the nature of John Roberts and the Gambinos, suggested that they ended up in the foundation of a new construction project in Jersey. The message was clear: you can rob a bank, you can hijack a truck, but you do not interrupt the flow of royalties from the #1 artist in the world. The mob did not act out of justice. They acted out of corporate governance. The kidnappers were a liability, a glitch in the system, and they were deleted. For Jimmy, the rescue was a turning point. He retreated further into drugs, trying to numb the reality of his existence. He saw demons everywhere now. He realized that the peace and love generation was a facade covering a world run by violent men in suits. He began to carry a gun himself. He became paranoid, trusting no one. The man who could summon lightning with his guitar was afraid of the dark. And rightfully so. He had peered behind the curtain of his own fame and seen the machinery at work. He saw that his talent was fueling an empire of crime. Every ticket sold, every record bought, was kicking up cash to the men who had kicked down that door. In the weeks following the kidnapping, the mob's presence around Jimmy increased. They were not just rescuers anymore, they were watchers. When Jimmy played a gig, there were always a few guys in the wings, arms crossed, watching the crowd, watching the exits, watching Jimmy. They were protecting their investment from competitors, from fans, and from Jimmy himself. It was a golden cage, similar to the one Louis Armstrong had lived in, but the 1960s version was more psychedelic, more chaotic, and ultimately more deadly. Jimmy was trapped in a swirl of managers, mobsters, and hangers-on, all taking a piece of him until there was almost nothing left. The story of the kidnapping is a stark reminder that the counterculture of the 60s did not destroy the old order, it just fed it. The hippies in the audience might have been flashing peace signs, but the men counting the money backstage were carrying switchblades. Jimi Hendrix was the bridge between these two worlds, the shaman of the flower power movement held captive by the soldiers of the syndicate. And on that night in September, when he walked out of that apartment building, breathing the free air, he was not really free. He had just been moved from a small prison cell to a larger one with stage lights and amplifiers, but a prison all the same. The mob had saved his life, yes. But in doing so, they had claimed his soul. And as we will see, once the mob claims you, they never really let you go. The rescue was just the beginning of the end for the voodoo child. If the kidnapping was the baptism, the year that followed was the confirmation. Jimi Hendrix returned to the world of the living, but he did not come back whole. The man who had walked onto the stage at Woodstock with a white fringed jacket and the confidence of a god was gone. In his place was a man who constantly checked the rearview mirror, a man who started keeping a loaded .22 caliber pistol in his guitar case, and who jumped at the sound of a closing door. The kidnapping had shattered the illusion of invincibility. Jimmy realized that his fame was not a shield, it was a neon sign inviting predators. And the biggest predator of them all was not hiding in a safe house in upstate New York. He was sitting right across the desk, wearing dark sunglasses and counting the money. Mike Jeffery. The relationship between Jimmy and Jeffery shifted from managerial control to total psychological domination. Jeffery used the kidnapping as a constant leverage point. "I saved you," was the subtext of every conversation. "The world is full of wolves, Jimmy, and I'm the only one holding the leash." Jeffery began to isolate the star. He fired longtime friends, restricted access to the backstage areas, and surrounded Jimmy with a new entourage of security personnel, thick-necked men from Queens and Brooklyn who did not know a chord progression from a car carburetor, but who knew how to break a nose. These were not roadies, they were wardens. Jimmy was technically the boss, the employer of everyone in the room, but he was the only one who could not leave. To tighten the noose, Jeffery and his silent partners in the syndicate embarked on a massive financial project, the construction of Electric Lady Studios in Greenwich Village. On paper, it was a dream come true for Jimmy, a state-of-the-art sanctuary where he could record whenever he wanted, free from the ticking clock of expensive commercial studios. He envisioned a rounded, psychedelic womb of creativity, a place where the walls curved and the lighting could be changed to match the mood of the music. But in the reality of New York City in 1970, a construction project was never just a construction project. It was a racket. Building Electric Lady Studios became a masterclass in mob economics. The location itself was an old nightclub called The Generation, a venue with deep roots in the underworld. When construction began, the costs spiraled out of control with suspicious speed. Walls that were built on Monday had to be torn down on Tuesday because of zoning issues. Deliveries of soundproofing material would vanish off the back of trucks. Then came the floods. The studio was built over an underground river, Minetta Creek, and the basement kept flooding. This required expensive pumps, expensive concrete, and expensive labor. Who supplied the concrete? Who supplied the labor? The unions controlled by the 5 families. Jimmy watched as his bank accounts were drained to feed the construction beast. He was generating millions on the road, playing grueling tours that left him exhausted and sick, only to see the money evaporate into the hole in the ground in Greenwich Village. He would ask Jeffery where the cash was going, and Jeffery would slide a stack of invoices across the desk, invoices from construction companies that existed only on paper, invoices for consulting fees paid to men with nicknames like the Plumber and Jimmy Blue Eyes. Jimmy was smart enough to know he was being robbed, but he was too trapped to stop it. He was paying for his own prison, brick by brick. The studio, however, was just one arm of the octopus. The musical direction was the other. Jimmy was evolving. He was tired of the showmanship, tired of burning guitars, tired of playing Purple Haze with his teeth. He wanted to explore jazz, funk, and soul. He formed the Band of Gypsies with Billy Cox and Buddy Miles, an all-black power trio that leaned into a groovier, more political sound. It was artistic liberation. But to Mike Jeffery and the mob financiers, it was a disaster. They did not want jazz. Jazz did not sell out stadiums. They wanted the Jimi Hendrix experience. They wanted the White Rock Trio. They wanted the hits. The pressure to conform was intense and threatening. Jeffery would scream at Jimmy in the studio, demanding commercial tracks. When screaming did not work, he used psychological warfare. There are stories, some confirmed, some legendary, of Jeffery staging accidents or manipulating Jimmy's drug supply to keep him pliable. The most chilling aspect was the alleged insurance policy. It is a persistent dark chapter in the Hendrix law that Mike Jeffery had taken out a massive life insurance policy on Jimmy, worth millions of dollars. In the cold calculus of the mob, an artist has a peak value. There comes a point where the artist is worth more dead, as a legend who sells records forever, than as a living, breathing human being who might fire his manager, get sober, or stop touring. Jimmy was approaching that crossover point. Jimmy sensed this. He began to tell friends, in hushed tones, "They going to kill me." He was not talking about crazy fans. He was talking about the suits. He tried to make moves to escape. He reached out to Warner Brothers, trying to bypass Jeffery. He had secret meetings with other lawyers. But in 1970, you did not just fire a mob-connected manager. It was not a legal dispute. It was a breach of territory. When Jeffery found out about these meetings, the retaliation was psychological terror. Jimmy would return to his hotel room to find it tossed, his lyrics stolen, his guitar strings cut. It was gaslighting on an industrial scale. The tension culminated in a specific incident at the newly finished Electric Lady Studios. Jimmy was recording, trying to find a moment of peace in the music. The studio was his sanctuary, the only place he felt safe. But then, the doors opened, and a group of investors walked in. They were not music executives. They were men in silk suits who looked out of place among the tie-dye and velvet. They walked into the control room, disrespecting the sacred silence of the session. They put their feet up on the mixing console. They smoked cigars, blowing smoke into the sensitive equipment. They stared at Jimmy through the glass. They did not say a word. They did not have to. The message was clear. This is not your house. We built it. We own it. And we own the sounds coming out of that guitar. Jimmy stopped playing. He put his guitar down and walked out of the room, shaking. He went to the bathroom and threw up. He realized that there was nowhere to hide. The studio was not a womb. It was a fishbowl, and the sharks were tapping on the glass. He was working for them. Every note he played was paying for their Cadillacs and their mistresses. The joy of music, the one thing that had saved him from a childhood of poverty, was being weaponized against him. In a desperate bid for autonomy, Jimmy planned a break. He went to London in late August 1970. He wanted to get away from New York, away from the construction racket, away from the guys in the long coats. He thought London would be safe. It was his second home, the place where he became a star. But Mike Jeffery followed him. The shadows stretched across the Atlantic. Jeffery showed up in London, hovering, organizing, controlling. He booked Jimmy into a grueling European tour that Jimmy did not want to do. The tour was a disaster. Jimmy was sick, exhausted, and mentally fraying. On stage in Germany, he was booed. He walked off stage after a few songs. The machine was breaking down. But the machine could not allow itself to break. It had to be profitable. This brings us to the final, murky days of September 1970. Jimmy was in London, staying at the Samarkand Hotel with a girlfriend, Monica Danman. He was making plans to leave Jeffery for good. He had reportedly called his lawyer in New York and told him to prepare the papers. He was going to cut the cord. He was going to take control of his master tapes. He was going to be free. This was the red line. In the world of organized crime, you can be a junkie, you can be late, you can be difficult. But you cannot leave. Leaving is stealing. And Jimi Hendrix was about to walk away with the most valuable intellectual property in the music business. The atmosphere in London was thick with paranoia. Jimmy told people he was being followed. He was terrified. And he had every reason to be. The insurance policy was still active. The manager was facing lawsuits and debts. The mob investors in New York wanted their return on investment. The equation was balancing out toward zero. On the night of September 17th, Jimmy was at a party. He was anxious. He took some amphetamines to stay up. Then later, back at the apartment, he took sleeping pills to come down. A lot of them. Vesprax. A powerful barbiturate. The official story is that he took too many by accident, vomited in his sleep, and choked. A tragic rock and roll cliché. But there are details that have never sat right with investigators or historians. The amount of wine found in his lungs during the autopsy was massive, yet there was very little alcohol in his blood. It suggested he had drowned in wine, not just choked on vomit. And the scarf he was wearing, tied around his neck. And then there is the confession. Years later, a former roadie named James Tappy Wright wrote a book claiming that Mike Jeffery, in a drunken stupor years after Jimmy's death, confessed to the murder. Jeffery allegedly said, "I had to do it. He was worth more to me dead than alive. That son of a bitch was going to leave me. If I lost him, I lost everything." Jeffery claimed he and a few friends went to the hotel room, poured wine down Jimmy's throat, and pills, ensuring he would never wake up to sign those papers firing his manager. Whether it was a murder carried out by mob-connected fixers or a tragic accident fueled by the stress and exhaustion of a life controlled by criminals, the result was the same. The mob did not just kidnap Jimi Hendrix in 1969. They slowly suffocated him over the next 12 months. They took his money, they took his art, they took his peace of mind, and finally, they took his life. The kidnapping was just the warning shot. The silence of September 18, 1970, was the final bullet. The voodoo child was dead, but the cash registers kept ringing. The records kept selling. And somewhere in a backroom in New York, a group of men in suits looked at the sales figures, lit their cigars, and agreed that it was a tragedy, yes, but a very profitable one. The body of Jimi Hendrix had barely been removed from the Samarkand Hotel when the scavengers arrived. In the world of organized crime and cutthroat music management, grief is an inefficient emotion. While fans around the world were lighting candles and crying in the streets, the men who had controlled Jimmy's life were busy securing their assets. The morning of September 18, 1970, kicked off one of the most shameful episodes in rock history, the great looting of the Hendrix estate. It was not a robbery committed by strangers. It was an inside job, executed with the precision of a military raid. The goal was not to preserve Jimmy's legacy. The goal was to erase the evidence of his independence and seize the one thing that was worth more than gold, the master tapes. Jimmy's London apartment was turned upside down. Witnesses reported seeing men in suits, associates of the management team, hauling boxes out of the building before the police had even secured the scene. These were not souvenir hunters. They knew exactly what they were looking for. Jimmy had been working on a massive amount of new material, songs that were moving away from the rock and roll formula Mike Jeffery demanded. He had a collection of tapes labeled Black Gold, a mythic suite of songs that reportedly contained his most personal and revolutionary work. Jimmy kept these tapes close, treating them as his insurance policy, his ticket to freedom. He knew that whoever held the tapes held the power. When the dust settled, the Black Gold tapes were gone. Diaries were missing. Contracts were missing. It was a surgical strike designed to ensure that no matter what Jimmy had signed or written in his final days, perhaps it will cutting Jeffery out, or a contract with a new label, it would never see the light of day. The mob understands that in a legal battle, he who destroys the paperwork wins. By scrubbing the apartment, the management team ensured that the narrative of Jimmy's death, and the ownership of his future, remained firmly in their hands. They controlled the estate, they controlled the image, and most importantly, they controlled the vault. Back in New York, the mood in the offices of Mike Jeffery was not one of mourning, but of frantic consolidation. The insurance policy, the grim document that valued Jimmy's death at a higher premium than his life, was cashed in. It was a massive payout, millions of dollars flowing into offshore accounts that Jeffery controlled. To the outside observer, it looked like a lucky break for a manager who was drowning in debt. To those in the know, it looked like a payoff for a hit. But money obtained through blood has a way of burning the hands that hold it. Mike Jeffery had won. He had defeated his rebellious star. He had secured the fortune. But he had also unleashed a curse that would hunt him down with the same relentless intensity he had shown Jimmy. In the years following Jimmy's death, Mike Jeffery became a man possessed. He was rich, but he was terrified. You see, the mob does not just do favors. The men who helped Jeffery, the men who facilitated the kidnapping rescue, the men who funded the studio, the men who perhaps helped silence the star, they wanted their cut. And the cut is always bigger than you expect. Jeffery began to tell friends that he was being followed. He became paranoid, seeing enemies in every shadow. The same psychological terror he had inflicted on Jimmy was now being reflected back onto him. He knew too much. He was a loose end. In the underworld, a manager who knows where the bodies are buried is a liability, especially one who is erratic, drug-addicted, and prone to bragging when he drinks. Jeffrey's behavior became increasingly bizarre. He retreated to his properties in Jamaica and Majorca, trying to put an ocean between himself and the New York syndicates. But you cannot outrun the reach of the organization. The pressure was mounting. There were lawsuits flying from Jimmy's family, from record labels, from rival promoters. The walls were closing in, just as they had for Jimmy. Jeffery was no longer the hunter. He was the prey. He had made a deal with the devil to control the voodoo child, but he forgot to read the fine print. The devil always collects his due. The end for Mike Jeffery came on March 5, 1973, in a burst of fire and metal that mirrored the violence of the era. Jeffery was in Majorca, Spain. He was scheduled to fly back to London to attend court hearings related to the Hendrix estate. He was nervous. He allegedly told friends that he felt something bad was going to happen. He boarded Iberia Airlines Flight 502, a DC-9 bound for London. He never made it. Mid-air over France, near the city of Nantes, the flight collided with a Spantax corvette. It was a catastrophic mid-air collision, a rare and horrific event. The Iberia plane spiraled out of the sky, disintegrating as it fell. All 68 people on board were killed instantly. Mike Jeffery, the man who had survived intelligence operations, mob wars, and the chaos of the 60s music scene, was incinerated in a field in France. When the news broke, a chill went through the rock community. To the public, it was a tragic accident. But in the whispered conversations of backstage dressing rooms and mob social clubs, it was seen as something else. Karma. Perhaps. But conspiracy theories began to swirl immediately. Some suggested that Jeffery had been targeted, that a bomb had been placed on board, or that the collision was too convenient to be a coincidence. While there is no evidence to support sabotage, the timing was impeccable. Jeffery was on his way to court, where he might have been forced to reveal where the money went. He might have been forced to name names. His death sealed the secrets of the Hendrix estate forever. The black gold tapes, the missing millions, the truth about the kidnapping, it all died with him in that wreckage. The death of Mike Jeffery closed the loop on the physical violence, but it opened a new chapter of corporate violence. With both the artist and the manager dead, the mob-connected lawyers and accountants stepped in to pick the carcass clean. This is where the story shifts from a crime thriller to a legal horror story. The Hendrix estate became a battleground. For decades, men in suits fought over who owned the rights to Jimmy's feedback. They released album after album of unfinished scraps, demo tapes, and rehearsal recordings, squeezing every cent out of the legacy. It was the ultimate triumph of the mob model. The product was finally separated from the troublesome human being who created it. This era pioneered the concept of the posthumous industry. The syndicate learned a valuable lesson from Jimi Hendrix. A dead icon is the perfect employee. He does not complain about tours. He does not ask for a higher royalty rate. He does not get arrested. He just sells. This model would be replicated later with Tupac, Biggie, and Kurt Cobain, but it was perfected on the bones of Jimi Hendrix. The Year of the Wolf did not end in 1970. It just moved from the streets to the courtroom. But there is a twist in the tale of the missing tapes. Years later, in a plot turn that feels like fiction, the black gold tapes resurfaced. They had not been destroyed. They had been stolen, yes, but not by the mob. Tony Brown, a drummer and friend of Jimmy's, revealed that he had taken them for safekeeping, knowing that Jeffrey's goons were coming. He sat on them for decades, terrified that if he revealed he had them, he would be killed. The fear of the mob was so pervasive that it silenced the music for 20 years. When the tapes were finally revealed, it was a voice from the grave, a reminder that while the gangsters could steal the money and the life, they could not quite steal the soul. However, the damage was done. The legacy of the mob's involvement in Jimmy's life left a stain that never fully washed out. We look at the photos of Jimmy in 1970, gaunt, exhausted, eyes darting sideways, and we do not see a rock star partying, we see a hostage. We see a man who realized too late that the music business was just organized crime with a better soundtrack. The kidnapping in 1969 was not a fluke. It was a statement of ownership. And the tragedy is that Jimmy knew it. He knew he was being fed to the wolves. His final interviews are filled with dark premonitions, cryptic warnings about plastic people and vampires. He was trying to tell us. He was screaming for help in the only language he knew, music, but the world was too busy dancing to listen. As we move to the conclusion of this dark saga, we have to ask ourselves, was the price of the music worth the cost of the man? The mob gave Jimmy the venues, the radio play, and the protection to become a star. But they also built the cage that killed him. It is the eternal question of the entertainment industry, written in the blood of its greatest guitarist. The devil went down to Georgia, but he set up shop in Greenwich Village, and he wore a suit and tie. And in the end, he got exactly what he wanted, a legend that would never grow old, never fade away, and never stop earning. The silence that followed the death of Jimi Hendrix was louder than his amplifiers ever were. In any normal homicide investigation, or even a suspicious accidental death, there are protocols. Detectives interview witnesses. Forensics teams sweep the room. Motives are analyzed. But in the case of Jimi Hendrix, the machinery of justice ground to a halt before it even started. The official verdict was inhalation of vomit due to barbiturate intoxication. An open and shut case. A rock star partied too hard and paid the price. It was a clean, easy narrative that fit the newspaper's headlines. But for anyone who dared to look past the police report, the scene at the Sama Khan Hotel was not a tragic accident. It was a crime scene that had been scrubbed, sanitized, and ignored by the authorities. The first cracks in the official story came from the very people who tried to save him. Dr. John Bannister, the surgical registrar at St. Mary Abbotess Hospital who fought to resuscitate Jimmy, noticed something terrifyingly specific. He reported that there was a massive amount of red wine in Jimmy's stomach and, more disturbingly, in his lungs. He described it as if the musician had been drowned in wine. Yet, the toxicology report showed a blood alcohol level that was relatively low. The math did not add up. How does a man have lungs full of wine but low blood alcohol? The medical implication is grim. The wine was introduced quickly, forcefully, and immediately prior to death, possibly while he was unconscious. It mimics a technique of torture and execution used by intelligence agencies and specialized mob enforcers, waterboarding, but with alcohol, designed to leave no bruises and look like a drunken aspiration. So why did not the police investigate? Why did not Scotland Yard tear apart Mike Jeffrey's alibi? Why did not they interrogate Monica Danman, the girlfriend whose story changed every time she told it? The answer lies in the systemic corruption and apathy of the era. To the British police in 1970, Jimi Hendrix was just another dead junkie. He was a black American musician with an afro and a drug habit. He was low priority. But there is a darker layer. In the late 60s and early 70s, the lines between the mafia, the music industry, and government intelligence were dangerously blurred. We have to remember the political climate. Jimi Hendrix was not just a guitarist, he was a symbol. By 1970, he was becoming increasingly politicized. He had donated money to the Black Panthers. He was speaking out about the Vietnam War. He was planning to play a free concert for the Black Panthers. In the eyes of the FBI's COINTELPRO operation, a secret program designed to neutralize radical political groups, Jimi Hendrix was a potential threat. He had the power to mobilize millions of young people. There is a documented history of the FBI using dirty tricks to destabilize black leaders. While it sounds like a conspiracy theory to suggest the government killed him, it is a documented fact that they watched him. And who did the government often use to do their dirty work in the domestic sphere? The mob. The syndicate and the establishment often had aligning interests. The mob wanted money, the government wanted quiet. A radical, outspoken, independent Jimi Hendrix was bad for both. If he left his manager, the mob lost millions. If he supported the Panthers, the government faced a PR nightmare. This convergence of interests created a zone of impunity. It meant that if something unfortunate happened to Jimmy, nobody was going to ask too many questions. The police investigation was rushed and superficial because, frankly, nobody in power wanted the truth to come out. A dead junkie is a cautionary tale. A murdered icon is a martyr who starts riots. This culture of a murder, the code of silence, extended deep into the music industry itself. Everyone knew Jeffery was dangerous. Everyone knew about the kidnapping a year prior. Everyone knew about the missing money. But nobody spoke up. The roadies, the producers, the session musicians, they all saw the fear in Jimmy's eyes, but they valued their careers more than his life. To speak out against Jeffery and his mob backers was to blacklist yourself from the industry, or worse. So, the community stayed silent. They went to the funeral, they cried for the cameras, and then they went back to work for the very same machine that had chewed Jimmy up. The looting of the apartment was the physical manifestation of this cover-up, but the psychological cover-up was even more effective. The media successfully painted Jimmy as a reckless drug addict, a wild man who was destined to burn out. This narrative absolved everyone of guilt. If Jimmy killed himself with his own excess, then the manager is not to blame, the mob is not to blame, and the industry is not to blame. It was a convenient lie that allowed the record companies to package his death as a romantic tragedy rather than a gritty homicide. They sold T-shirts with his face on them, perpetuating the myth of the 27 Club, a mystical curse that takes young artists. But there is nothing mystical about a manager who owes mobsters money and an artist who is worth more dead. That's not a curse. That's accounting. The tragedy of the investigation is that the clues were there. The black gold tapes being stolen was a clear sign of intent. The discrepancies in the timeline of death, Jimmy was likely dead hours before the ambulance was even called, suggest a cleanup operation was taking place while the body went cold. Monica Danman, the only witness, lived the rest of her life in a state of erratic guilt, changing her story repeatedly until her own suicide years later. She was a pawn in a game she did not understand, trapped in a room with a dead legend, likely terrified of the men who had come and gone before the ambulance arrived. This failure of justice sent a chilling message to every other artist in the industry. It reinforced the power of the handlers. It said, "We own you. And if you try to leave, you won't not just lose your contract, you'll lose your life, and we will write the history of how it happened." The mob's control over the music industry did not end with Jimmy. It solidified. They realized they could operate with total immunity. The police would not look closely at rock and roll deaths. It was the perfect crime. As we look back at the timeline, the kidnapping in '69, the force tour, the insurance policy, the threats, and finally the wine in the lungs, it becomes impossible to see them as isolated events. They are pearls on a string, a sequence of escalations by a criminal enterprise losing control of its asset. The kidnapping was the warning, "We can touch you anywhere." The death was the execution of that threat. The police were merely the janitors who swept up the mess, filed the paperwork, and looked the other way, leaving the wolves to feast on the legacy. Jimi Hendrix did not just die, he was erased, and in his place, a profitable product was installed, one that would never ask for a royalty check and never speak truth to power again. In the decades that have passed since 1970, the name Jimi Hendrix has ceased to be a name. It has become a logo, a brand, a face printed on T-shirts worn by people who have never heard Machine Gun. This transformation was the final, masterstroke victory of the syndicate. When they lost the man, they gained the icon. And icons are much easier to manage. They do not miss flights. They do not fire managers. They do not ask for audits. The mob-connected machinery that surrounded Jimmy in life did not dissolve when he died. It just changed gears. It shifted from management to estate management. The lawsuits, the unauthorized releases, the merchandising deals, it became a billion-dollar industry built on the bones of a 27-year-old man who just wanted to play the blues. The tragedy of Jimi Hendrix is not just that he died young. It is that he died right when he was about to break free. The kidnapping in 1969 was the pivotal moment where the trap snapped shut, but 1970 was supposed to be the year he gnawed his leg off to escape. He was moving toward jazz, toward political activism, toward a sound that was blacker, deeper, and more dangerous to the commercial interests of his handlers. The mob did not just kill a rock star, they killed a revolution. They silenced a voice that was preparing to scream the truth about the system that owned him. By keeping him tethered to the purple haze image, they robbed the world of the music he would have made, the symphonies, the collaborations with Miles Davis, the sounds that were locked in his head when the wine filled his lungs. This story serves as a dark mirror to the entertainment industry of the 20th century. We like to believe that talent rises to the top, that art conquers all. But the kidnapping of Jimi Hendrix proves that talent is a resource, and like oil or diamonds, it attracts the most ruthless predators on earth. The mob viewed Jimi not as a genius, but as an oil well. When the well tried to cap itself, they drilled it open. The protection they offered was the protection of a farmer guarding his livestock from wolves, only to slaughter them himself when the market price was right. The lesson of the Jimi Hendrix kidnapping is a lesson in the nature of power. In 1969, when those thugs snatched him off the street, they thought they were the bad guys. But they were just amateurs. The real bad guys were the ones who kicked down the door to save him. The real bad guys were the ones who wore suits, bought him drinks, and called him brother while secretly taking out insurance policies on his life. It deconstructs the myth of the benevolent gangster. Yes, the mob chased away the kidnappers. Yes, they scared off the street hustlers. But they did not do it for Jimi. They did it because you do not let strangers steal your property. The rescue was a repossession. As we look back at the grainy footage of Woodstock, or listen to the wailing feedback of the Star-Spangled Banner, we must listen with new ears. That sound, that screaming, distorted, agonizing sound, was not just an artistic choice. It was the sound of a man fighting for his life against a machine he could not see. It was the sound of a prisoner rattling the bars of a golden cage. The mob might have won the war for the money. They might have kept the tapes and the royalties, but they could not capture the spirit. The kidnappers are gone. Mike Jeffery is gone, burned to ash in a French field. The wise guys in the social clubs are gone, victims of Rico acts and old age. But the music remains. It hangs in the air like smoke, a testament to the one thing they could not kill. Jimi Hendrix walked through the valley of the shadow of death, flanked by gangsters and thieves, and he managed to leave a trail of fire that still burns today. The story of his kidnapping is a grim reminder that in the music business, the devil does not always wait at the crossroads to make a deal. Sometimes, he kicks down your door, cuts your ropes, puts you in the back of a Lincoln Continental, and tells you that you're safe. And that is the most terrifying lie of all.